It's Amanda Smith, and this is my best campaign. There was maybe a 5-year period when I would complain, mainly to myself, that there were no good newsletters or publications that covered the overlap of fashion and sport. And then one day, the Sweat Lookbook landed in my inbox. It's a weekly Substack written by Lee Glandorf, former director of marketing at Tracksmith and current free agent brand consultant. And it's exactly what we were missing. It's smart, plugged-in commentary on fashion and athletics through a marketer's lens. Now, Lee is a lifelong athlete. She's a rower turned runner and a brilliant writer. And as the tech overlords like to say is the thing that truly matters nowadays, she has great taste. I've wanted to get Lee on the show for ages. We've literally been talking about it for a year, and we finally found the perfect moment right after marathon season. Lee had collaborated with 2 fellow Substackers on a multi-brand pop-up at the Boston Marathon, and then went on to support Brooks at the London Marathon. So she had a front row view of the hundreds of brand activations happening at both. And I wanted to know, who nailed it? And how did standout brands show up in a super busy marathon village? How do you avoid fading into the hundreds of other activations and shakeout runs competing for attention? Lee totally delivered. She took me through the highs and lows and talked about what she learned doing her own pop-up. And she spotted what might be the biggest missed opportunity for brands in the athletic space today. Lee, you're fresh back from 2 I'm guessing very intense weeks at the Boston and London marathons. And there's a lot of people who probably read your takes on both of these experiences on Substack. But for those who haven't already discovered you, explain a little bit about what it is that you do and why you are going to these marathons.
Awesome. Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me. I'm psyched to finally have a convo with you after much back and forth behind the scenes. I am a marketer and a writer with, almost 15 years of experience. I got started in fashion and then transitioned to sports. And that has really come full circle in what I write about these days on my newsletter, the Sweat Lookbook, which looks at the intersection of sports and fashion through the lens of the female athlete. I spent 7 years at Tracksmith and I'm also an endurance athlete myself. I was a rower in college and have run pretty much since I stopped rowing. And so running tends to really be the locus of a lot of my insights just because I have such a deep background in the sport, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, I love that. Taking your background in fashion, your years-long history in sport. And you were, I think, I'd been thinking about this for a long time. Like, no one was capturing the overlap of sport and fashion to the degree that I really wanted. And so when I discovered the Sweat Lookbook, it just felt like a breath of fresh air, like the thing that I'd been waiting for. I was an early adopter and, one of the few paid Substacks that I regularly read. And I get so much out of it every week. New brands, perspective on how brands are showing up, but also all the fun projects that you're doing, which leads me to talking about the Rec Room. You popped up at the Boston Marathon, your hometown. Talk to me about what the Rec Room was.
Yeah. So, part of the joy of building on Substack, and every platform has its challenges, but what I've enjoyed is some of the social elements of the network and being able to connect with like-minded writers across both sports and fashion, and then do with those connections what you will. And so I pretty early on the platform became close friends, email friends with Cole Townsend, who has a Substack called The Running Supply. And we had gone way back. He's also in Boston. So I had known him casually for a long time. And then Katie Douglas, who writes a Substack called Running Wilder, but also has her own store in San Francisco, a running lifestyle boutique called Running Wilder. And over the last 2 years, I launched my Substack in 2024. We've become a little crew of 3 people who just see the world through a similar lens. Yeah. And Katie and I had popped up in a very, very small way last year to support a women's led running brand called Prusin. At the Boston Marathon, we basically took over a small wine shop that I found in the South End and set up some racks. And it was really fun and a great opportunity to bring a lot of women together. And what I love about Katie is she's kind of crazy like me. And she was like, next year, bigger and better. And so we were planning on doing some kind of pop-up again, Katie and I. And then in, I want to say January or something, Cole texted me and just said, hey, can you take a look at this pitch deck that I'm putting together to talk to some brands about, putting together a pop-up for them for the Boston Marathon. And I said, I love the deck, but do you want to team up with me and Katie so that we're not cannibalizing each other's work in this space? And so Cole, like the great ally and friend that he is, was like, yeah, let's team up together. And Cole had originally had a relationship with Rad Running. You might have seen their UFO sneaker. It's like super intense, jumpy trampoline trainer. And they were interested in popping up in Boston. And so they kind of became our like cornerstone brand that had committed to saying like, we want to do this and we'll put in a decent amount of what effectively was underwriting the rent on whatever space we found. And then we had a very long road from January until basically March 30th, trying to find a spot that would work for the Boston Marathon to allow us to bring in a bunch of small indie brands that wouldn't have had the budget or the team space to execute something like that. And really, honestly, finding the real estate was probably the thing in addition to budget that would be hardest for an indie brand, just because the bandwidth to call up all these management companies and try to figure out if they had spaces available on Newbury Street. The one benefit in Boston is that there's really only one place that you can be. It's Newbury Street. Yeah. So at least it limited the options, but we were down to the wire looking for a spot. And fortunately we found a really great spot that was originally we kind of poo-pooed because it was basement level. And we were also pretty sure it had been a condom world in a past life. So I was kind of worried that it would be really janky inside. It turned out in between being the condom world and its past life, it had been like a boxing gym. So it was like pretty white washed walls and like a parquet floor. So it's straightforward. And so when we found it and it was a little out of budget, but it wasn't crazy out of budget. And we pitched it back to Rad and a few of the other brands. I think Katie and Cole, Katie was like, we should just really lean into the basement vibes. It's more Rad, which has kind of like that punk subcultural skateboard kind of energy anyway. And then I just named it the Rec Room. Literally, we had a Google Doc going of like how we were planning it. And we had a working name before and I just like went in and was like, the Rec Room, that's it. And so we figuratively and literally ran with that. And, over the next 2-3 weeks, pulled together a fun little space that was about creating a nice place to hang for runners. It's funny how sometimes you can't engineer the cool stuff, right? Mm-hmm. Like if we had decided we were going to make it a basement vibe, I don't think it would have been cool as having kind of wandered into the basement vibe. It 100% ended up allowing us to create the energy which we wanted, which was just a great space for runners to come together that was going to feel chill, feel a little different from like the hyper curated spaces that, a Hoka or an On can put out during the events, and really just give a platform for indie brands, basically a wrap and some like-minded energy. What I loved, because I was standing at the back of the store a lot, was like Soar was right next to Anna, and they represent such totally different approaches to running in the sport. And that's what made the space fun, was to be able to bring together brands that are all on the rise, that are all trying to cater to the runner, but in different ways, and be able to have that through Katie and Cole and my lens feel synergistic. And part of it was just because the brands came in with a low ego. And I remember Raid was the only brand that proposed like an activation setup. Like they were like, here's the signage we can send. And Cole was basically like, no, I found this really cool antique tie rack and we're going to hang the belts off that. And they just said, okay, do it, So it was a unique alchemy, because I've worked, with brands for a long time, and getting folks to be comfortable, not slapping their logo over everything is tough. And it might only work with small brands where you have a relationship one-to-one with the founder and they can, trust you to steward the brand. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if we're going to jump ahead to takeaways and stuff like that, I think it's a good reminder for brands that sometimes the best way to show up is through someone else's vision that you trust, and not in the like, here, take all my logos and all my decals and everything, because it feels cringy pretty quickly.
Yeah. The really fun thing about having a pop-up curated by 3 Substackers is after someone like me who follows all three of you got to read about it from your three different perspectives. And you all did a really good job of documenting that process of, finding a space initially and then getting outbid on your initial space before finding this other space. And as I'm thinking about it, it feels really telling about kind of the state of pop-ups right now. Just like everyone, I was just talking about this on the last episode with Sydney Baptista from Pioneers. Like everyone is popping up everywhere. The competition for space at a week or a weekend like the Boston Marathon is so intense. And like you said, it's a limited amount of space. What were kind of your takeaways? I mean, we're going to talk about this today, but big picture, what was your gut feeling having then done a pop-up in the space about like what's happening? What is the landscape right now?
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, for context for your listeners, one of my first projects I did at Tracksmith was their Boston Marathon pop-up in 2016, which was not on Newbury Street. It was one block up on Boylston, directly across from the expo, in an insanely large space that is now free people, but was a bank, now free people. And back then, there was no competition really for pop-ups. Janji, I think, we were talking about it at the rec room. I think Janji, a couple years before, had popped up in a paint store that's still on Newbury Street. But for a couple of years at Tracksmith, we were the only people popping up outside of the expo. And so we had a real corner on creating something that felt differentiated. And it was a shit ton of work and way harder than activating in the expo because there's nothing turnkey about it. Every space the first place Tracksmith popped up and it is where their store and HQ currently are. So we only went someplace different for 1 year and then we actually ended up back in that space and then ultimately it became the store. But still, it's a lot of work to take over a space and make it feel like a space that runners want to be in and have the brand engage with it. And because it's a lot of work, I think that's why a lot of the execution tends to feel kind of turnkey. I'll share my other chief complaint about pop-ups is that similarly in 2017 when Tracksmith launched the Track House, I named it the Track House. And now everyone's execution is always something with a house in it, but it's never as good as the Track House. And I'm like, guys, just abandon the house. Hoka called their place the Lighthouse, which just really irritated me because it was bad Boston marketing and also just a lazy use of house.
It was like too on the nose for the East Coast to have a lighthouse.
Yeah. Well, it's like anytime people want to activate in Boston and they're like, we'll have lobster rolls. And I'm like, please, God, no need.
We've eaten enough of them.
Yeah. So anyway, basically as every story goes right now in marketing after 2020, the desire and the interest in experiential marketing went cuckoo, running went cuckoo. And now everyone wants to have a piece of the pop-up pie. It works particularly well in Boston. And if I was going to advise a small brand, I would say save your money and figure out a way to be in Boston because Newbury Street is 6 blocks, very walkable. And you can, if you're on that space, have a good space, you'll catch the runners. It's like, shooting fish in a barrel. Whereas, for example, I was in London right after, and that city is so huge. It was difficult this past weekend because there was a tube strike. So runners were having a harder time moving around the city. So I got the sense from a lot of different brands that their activations weren't quite, hitting the same way they might have in previous years because it was just difficult for the athletes to make it as many places as they would have. Whereas in Boston and even some extent in New York, a lot of the activations have focused in Soho. But in Boston particularly, you have one street and you have 100,000 runners just strolling around looking to spend money. So yeah, everyone wants to be in that space, executing in some house-like format. And it's become a lot of rinse repeat of the same activations. It's hard to stand out.
Yeah. And you all did stand out. It sounds like the Rec Room showed up quite different than what every other brand was doing for many reasons. What do you think was the impact of the Rec Room looking back?
Yeah, it's so funny. This is a terrible, I'm revealing myself to be a terrible marketer in that I at least went in mostly wanting to create a good experience for the brands that signed on to be a part of it and help introduce them to some runners and basically make back the investment that they'd put in to the pop-up space. And so that was my focus, right? And I think Cole, Katie, and I are on Substack for a reason, right? And we're not on Instagram putting our faces on there for a reason. So neither of us none of us are particularly concerned with going viral or like growing a mega audience. Like we care about the sport. We care about engaging with people who love the sport, and we care about doing, I think, as Katie would probably call, cool shit. And I think because we were clear-eyed on that, we were able to make some cool shit that people recognized as like authentically interesting and different, and felt kind of like, I hate to say a kumbaya spirit, but it was a kumbaya spirit of like everyone working together to make something cool, make something rad in the case of rad, without a lot of ego. And I think it sucks to say, but I think that's rare and running right now.
Yeah. Sounds like you weren't trying to match what the algorithm expects of you, which is probably what a lot of activations are doing now. You weren't going for like a photo moment or like a big splash. It was way more driven by connection than anything else.
I think, you know, we wanted to create a platform that presented the brands in a way that made them, you know, feel differentiated and was digestible to the runner, right? I think one thing that was important to me, I was staffing the Prusen area and some of the other women-led brands, and I like wanted to give the runners space to discover rather than jump down their face with like, do you know this brand? Can I get you something? Just because Boston has become so consumption driven. Everywhere you go, there's something free to take. There's some kind of QR code to scan. There's a line. Like, that's exhausting. I don't know how marathoners do it. When I run a marathon, I get in, get out. So I think just trying to focus on what is an energy that is contrary to kind of the prevailing mood was what our goal was. And we'd all been around the block for a while in this space. So we've been in spaces that are like loud and exhausting and not conducive to hang.
Mm-hmm. What made it feel like a win for you?
I was really excited about this little activation we did with Bonzer, which is a sunglasses brand out of Dallas. She's basically a one-woman show, made cute sunglasses that fit women's faces and are like not hyper teched out, right? You can wear them to the beach or on a long run and they're going to look great either way. And they're like $130, great price point. So it's like a really solid product. She signed on early and was like, I want to do some kind of activation. And we were exploring girly kind of ways to show up. And I was like, how could we do some kind of like race face activation where we help women finish their race day look? Because that's become so much more of a thing in the last couple of years, whether it's like your braid or your makeup. And had an identifies it because I'd written a story on them. And so I just sent them a note, like, would you send product for this activation? And they said yes. And I actually double checked. I'm shocked that that Facet hasn't made race face like their tagline.
Yeah.
I think that they just don't have a runner internally who's figured it out, but I've stolen it now. It's Bonzer's. It's Race Face by Bonzer. And so we just set up this cute little corner where women could get like some Facet. We worked with Forta, which is a new women-led makeup brand by Lexi Hall, WNBA basketball player. They sent setting spray. We had buckle scrunchies. We had some like those hair stars that everyone likes, and then a few little spools of ribbon where people could cut their own ribbon for their race day look. And it was just so fun to stand there and tell women runners who came by that like, hey, this is a free activation. Take what you want. We have got little goodie bags, and see them just like get excited and light up. And it really reinforced for me a thesis that I'd started last year with Katie, just that there aren't enough activations built with women in mind and the way they like to experience these races. And so if you do something that works well for them, they'll get really excited. And so it's fun. It's fun to see that mirrored back when you're like, okay, I have an inkling that this is the way that women want to be acted with more and more at these races, more than like a shakeout, you know? Yeah. So it was fun to have that reaffirmed in my face.
Do you have a sense of the balance of men to women at a race like Boston?
I mean, Katie and I definitely were looking up every once in a while in the rec room and being like, oh yeah, it's still a lot of dudes, especially amongst the like, you know, Boston really revealed to me something this is not an insight, but there are kind of two camps in running right now, which is like, there's the stalwart long timers who at Boston are all in their blue and yellow and like decked out in unicorns, and they're decidedly uncool and they do not care. They want to buy all the Boston merch and spend a lot of money and run Boston 1,700 times. Mm-hmm. And then there's this newer, and I say newer because some of these people have run for a long time, but they still fit in this cohort of like cool kid creatives who are all in black and baggy, and they are less likely to buy the merch, more interested in kind of like seeing what's interesting in the sport. And they kind of, there is some overlap, but there's not a ton of overlap. I would say the cool kid still tends to skew more male. It's like that cool kid creative director guy.
Mm-hmm.
And then the old school is like maybe 50-50.
Okay.
But so long story short, I think there's still a lot of room, especially for women, to come together and take up space, just because the men, they travel in packs, there's more of them, and then women tend to get more diffuse within it. It's the same thing when you watch the race, right? I was in London and a friend of mine said, just pay attention to how crazy it is to watch the first 1,000 runners, everyone under 3, and like see how many women you see. And it's so few within that group. And it really makes you realize how much room there is for women in the sport to take up more space.
Yeah. I mean, that just exactly what you just described, the way the men traveling the packs, the women being probably more on their own. They might be the only person in their peer group that can run at that elite of a level. So figuring out how to better serve that woman to create space for more of them to come into the space would be really interesting. It seems like you started to crack the code of how to serve that particular like cool kid female runner.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think there's a big hole in terms of serving what I like to call the run girly. Like, because the cool kid runner doesn't really overlap with the run girly aesthetic. You know, she's in a Free People, like pleated short and hair doodads, right? Mm-hmm. And it's because it's ultra feminine, it's inherently not cool, right? Yeah. Wow. And, you know, even brands like Bandit with Artist Sinks, you know, she's the co-founder, she's a woman. Yeah. The energy, it's feminine, but it still skews masculine a little bit, right? Because so it has to fit that cool energy. Minimal. And women look great in the product, and that's why they like it. But I don't see a lot of brands serving the like run girly, except for like Free People, and they're raking in money, and Fazit, they're raking in money, but they're on the fringe. They're not endemic to the sport. And so I'm just really interested in ways that endemically in the sport, we can celebrate this kind of persona that's really transforming the sport in a way that acknowledges that like they're driving a lot of change in the sport, spending a lot of money, and they're like core to the sport as like the run, you know, the super fast run guy, you know? Yeah. And I think brands are scared to acknowledge it just because it's like, ooh, feminine, girly, cringe immediately, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm interested in exploring that tension and figuring like, how can we blend the two worlds?
That's a great question. I could go down that path further, but
I know.
Actually, I think that's a perfect.
So too.
Yeah, seriously. That is such a good transition to talking about Brooks, because actually I think Brooks has done a good job of serving women, and they have products that maybe lean more, can lean more girly, but increasingly they're moving into a more interesting lifestyle hypey space. Your trip to London that you just got back from was with Brooks, and I would say they're having a bit of a moment. They've been this sort of trusted mainstay forever, but they're finally claiming their own little piece of cool and hype. What did they do in London?
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting to look back. I mean, Brooks activated really well in London as maybe a case study for how to show up when you're actually not owning the race particularly. You know, they had almost no pros in the race at all. A lot of their pros were in Boston, but they activated more aggressively in London than they did in Boston. Though they did both. They did the Hyperion House in both London and in Boston. Mm-hmm. But I would say because in London, they had all their pros available who weren't racing, kind of out and engaging. Okay. And then they had Cynthia Erivo, who was effectively their pro athlete in the marathon. And they really elevated her and treated her like a pro.
Which was such a fun story to follow and watch.
For sure. And you know what's so funny? I kept saying to everyone, I was like, I used to DM with Cynthia Erivo when I was at Tracksmith, because she's like she's Harry Styles. She's a long-term runner who's been, chipping away at the sport for a while. Yeah. And so I would send her gear, and we didn't have the budget to sponsor her other than to send gear. But I was always like, I'm shocked that no brands are picking her up. And I was even more shocked once she got Wicked that no brand scooped her up, because she was still running. She felt like an easy fit for like an On or something like that.
Totally.
And so I thought it was really smart that Brooks, decided to bring her into their like roster and use her as a champion for this campaign, because, I talk about it all the time. The majority of people running have no freaking clue who's at the top of the marathon stats, except for, in London, Sebastian Salway, he broke 2. Now people know that name.
Yeah.
They definitely didn't, the majority of people before that race. I'll admit I didn't know it, and I follow the sport pretty closely. Same. And so I think it's really savvy of these brands to recognize when there's a cut through moment in the sport that allows them to talk to both performance, right? Cynthia ran really well. She trained really hard. Mm-hmm. They super smartly connected Cynthia with Erica Kemp, one of their pro runners, to have her coach. Yeah. Which created this very interesting story and a very engaging story. They did a live podcast with Des and Kara Goucher, and had them talk about it. Yeah. And it was really smart to capitalize, because they could have just put Cynthia up on the stage by herself, but it was really smart to showcase kind of the chemistry and what she'd learned in working with a pro. And I think Erica's a really strong pro for Brooks too. So yeah, I think it was, I think whether or not they made the most noise in London, I don't know. Obviously I was in their bubble, so it's hard to kind of parse that out. But I would say for a brand that wasn't showing up with the fastest runners at the London Marathon, really figured out a smart way to cut through the noise. And I saw they just decorated Cynthia's shoes with like little medallions of her dogs on it. And they were able, their PR team worked hard. They got it on all the annoying Instagram accounts that rehash all the same news. I saw it 1 trillion times.
I did too.
Cynthia was everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so they really were able to own the sub-elite story, right? you can't compete with Adidas having the fastest runners in the world and the fastest shoe in the world. They weren't trying to compete necessarily with, I think, another brand that did quite well was Puma with their Project 3 athletes, which were really noticeable on the course. There's a ton of people in that pink sherbet kit. But if you're not trying to be the fastest in the world, and you're not, in that sub-elite cohort, like Cynthia Erivo is you see yourself in that athlete, because 320 is fast, but not insane. And it's knowing that she's working incredibly hard. She's working on a West End show, one woman show while training is just mega relatable, and so I think they did a good job capitalizing on a story that really was going to resonate with a wide group of people. Yeah.
The celebrity as run ambassador is really interesting. And you made a great point. The Harry Styles obviously made a big splash for his time, but Cynthia's story to me was actually more engaging. It was Harry's fast and he looks great when he runs. But Cynthia, the dynamic between her and Erica made, I think, a story you could stretch out and get a little bit more legs out of, because you were following her on a journey as they were sharing about her training and her, improvement along the way. I think it worked really well, personally.
Honestly, they probably could have brought people along that journey even longer, right? Could have announced it earlier. I'm sure, there's so many moving pieces that go into how these things get signed, but it would have been really interesting to watch the story unfold, throughout the training cycle. So next time, that's my feedback. Tell the full story.
Do you think this could be the beginning of the era of the celebrity runner, who's not a runner that becomes a celebrity, but a celebrity who leans into their running career? I mean,
we're certainly in it, right? We have the Diplo. Who does New Balance has? New Balance has a couple of folks on their roster that are musicians. My one carve out is that a lot of these run clubs that have started, Travis Barker, all by men, right? And so it's nice to see, a woman kind of be the vocal leader in it, and a woman not be afraid to lean into this idea of a performance mindset, and be fearful that it might maybe detract from her opportunities outside of running. Cause I could see, you don't know if other actresses aren't kind of being vocal about their kind of running ecosystem because they're afraid it will pigeonhole how they get cast and things like that. maybe a male musician or some of the guys who are doing this don't have to worry about.
Listen, maybe you fell into this very common trap. Your brand grew a ton in the early days of COVID. People were spending money and you couldn't stock product fast enough. And then the hangover hit and you were stuck with inventory that just wouldn't move. You started discounting, you started leaning on performance marketing, and today you're still stuck in this cycle of paying to acquire new customers month after month. Your brand is starting to show up as a commodity and you want to get out of the discounting trap and finally make your comeback. Well, we want to help you build a cult brand, the kind that people will go out of their way for and that they'll pay more for even when they have other options. I'll tell you exactly where your comeback starts, and it might surprise you because it's not an expensive campaign and it's not even a brand refresh. It starts with your brand voice. A powerful brand starts with giving your fans a shared vocabulary. A shared vocabulary creates shared identity, and that's how cult brands start. If you know it's time to stop chasing customers and want to create real lifelong fans, my team at Monday Creative can get you there. See how we've done it for brands like Keen, Lululemon, Adidas, and Arc'teryx over at mondaycreative.co. Okay, so Brooks nailed the sponsorship side of things. I guess you were hanging out at Hyperion House for a lot of the time. What is that experience like?
So they do it differently in each space. This Hyperion House was in the outer net, right in Tottenham Square Road. So it was like this big expansive space, kind of like a digital experience that you got to have. I think that when it comes to like brand houses, probably the brand that's doing it best right now is New Balance in terms of like they have a run house, but their run house concept has really been like honed in over the last like year, where they start to take over these really iconic venues in different cities. And what's interesting about New Balance is they take over these spaces, they build them out quite beautifully, but there's no commercial goals associated with the space. Like that's not
There's
where
no
they're
retail.
selling product.
It's purely brand.
Yeah, except, I mean, at the Run House in London, you could test out shoes, right? They had an opportunity to test the Ellipse. So it wasn't totally brand, like you can't buy them there, but that's a selling moment, a product education moment. But for the most part, the space is to sit, interact, relax, which I think is really unique. What's noteworthy is they don't do it in Boston. They did it in Rome. They did it in Paris. They did it in London. In Boston, they do a marathon event at the track. I think there's a huge opportunity for them to do something interesting in Boston. I think, it works better for them at London where they have, apparel rights for the race. So they're selling a crap ton of gear too. Yeah. And so they can execute in an elevated way because their logo is everywhere on the brand in addition to that, because they have that title sponsorship. But yeah, I think it's an interesting way of showing up. And it's certainly like the most on the nose in terms of hitting that intersection of performance and lifestyle, which is really where running is at, right? Where this is a way of living that runners embody. It's not just about what happens on the race course. And so creating a space much like the Rec Room where people can relax and engage and create community, and that's the priority, I think it's way more successful than, a purely commercial venture, just because it's so transactional on the other hand.
Okay, that's great. That's actually a perfect segue into what I want to talk about, which is brand activations at these marathons. So I know you were inside a lot during Boston, but it sounds like you got out a little bit and got to explore some of the pop-ups that were happening there, and you definitely had some time in London. Let's walk through the brand highlights. Who were your favorites? Let's talk about a few. I know Rabbit was a highlight for you in Boston, which was an unexpected one for me because I think of Rabbit as like very much deep in the trail space. And I'm curious to know how they would pop up in a more traditional marathon setting.
Yeah, well, Rabbit's been popping up in Boston for a while. I know this because when I was at Tracksmith, people used to walk in and say, "Is this Rabbit?" And be like, "No, wrong animal with ears on it," because ours is hair. Sure. They've been at this game for a while. I wouldn't say that they've ever previously really cut through in terms of the way they showed up in Boston. They've been big purveyors of blue and yellow gear that says Boston on it, which always does quite well. But
leaning hard into the merch.
Quite transactional. But this year they partnered with an up and coming artist named Zach Litoff and basically gave him the reins to their pop-up to execute his vision, which was this running is punk execution, which I love. It's very Satisfy Light in the way that he did it, but he did it in his own way. I wouldn't say it's Satisfy Light in the execution, just the idea of running as punk is very Satisfy. But as a result, their space felt so much more original than it would have if it was just straight Rabbit House, because it had his fingerprints all over it. And like literally he made 99 posters inspired by the race that were all over the space. There was kind of like a cool old TV installation, but the graphics that he did for Boston were very punk inspired. They were graffiti inspired. They were totally different from any other product available on Newbury Street. And I know those pieces flew out the door and they all sold out. And I think it was really successful for the brand. And it was successful because again, we talked about low ego. They gave Zach this platform to create something cool. And because they gave him a big runway to do so, he was able to execute and create something that had a vision that Rabbit, in terms of how their brand currently shows up, definitely wouldn't have done that on their own. And if they had done it on their own, it wouldn't have felt particularly authentic. It might have felt kind of like, what? Why is Rabbit trying to claim this point of view? And so I thought it was a really great lesson in a well-executed partnership. And even like Zach, I think he has like, I hadn't heard him before. He's got like 12K Instagram followers. So he's not a huge artist, right? He's not, but he's very endemic to the sport. He's got a strong following among people who like care about the sport. And like in terms of reverberating down Newbury Street, people started to see the merch, see it was cool. And then they're like, oh, that's the merch I want. You know, that's where I want to go in. And I think it just allowed them to stand out in the crowd of like blue and yellow Boston products. Yeah. Because they had a strong point of view. Right.
Yeah. Three things that are coming out for me. The first one, strong point of view. Trusting your collaborators, like bringing in a collaborator and not giving them too many guardrails. Like he obviously had the guardrails of the baseline Boston you know, identity, but really owning it and making his own and not trying to fit into a particular Rabbit motif necessarily. And then this idea of maybe like remixing what's there. So he did it in a fresh way, not relying on kind of like the same old.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was a risk, right, for Rabbit. Like, and they hedged their bets a little bit. They had their traditional Boston that was blue and yellow gear. And like, you know, to be honest, a lot of people's complaints about Boston is that it is quite staid. It's quite heritage. And a lot of brands are, you know, don't want to mess with that because so much of the audience is that person. This just reminded me that sometimes it's good to take a risk. Yeah. You know? Yeah. Sometimes it's good to say like, we're gonna put our, you know, we're gonna stand out from the crowd and not be afraid to say like, yeah, Boston, you're typically one way, but we're gonna deliver it a different way. And it worked.
Okay. So Rabbit stood out to you. You talked about New Balance. Who else did you think did a great job of showing up?
So I mentioned Puma. You know, their Project 3, I think, has been quite successful in terms of getting product. Now, I wouldn't say this is a totally different way. I don't think that they made much impact in terms of activation in either city, at least from what I could tell in terms of like in-person engagement. This is purely like standing on the race course, watching runners come by and what stands out to you, what has an impact. Yeah. You know, and they've put money behind supporting this sub-elite tier of athlete, people who are in that, like, I think it's 315 and under, at least for women, zoned, that fast window of runner, providing them with like opportunities to train, get better, you know, I think all the classic like testing, fueling, all that kind of stuff. And then gave them a really sick pink sherbety kit and gave them shoes that help them run fast. And on the course, especially in that front edge of the field, is especially noticeable in London, they really stood out. You know, I swear in London, I was talking about how there weren't many women in the front of the field. It seemed like every woman that I saw who wasn't a pro was in Puma, you know, and that has an impact, right? And you can kind of say, like we talk about, you know, if you have limited budget, you can try to show up with an activation and give away a bunch of free stuff. Or you can say like, no, we're going to make a statement in the race itself. Right. Yeah. And I thought this was a really good example of like, there's still meaning in showing up that way. And, you know, there's a lot of that cohort of like sub-elite speedy people has a lot of cut through, at least as a bystander standing on the side of the course. Now, again, I'm like slightly biased because I'll tend to like to watch the pros, and then I might have friends who are in like that faster cohort. So I think I think a different brand might be really interesting to solely focus that energy on the back of the pack. You know, it could be so cool to just do the exact opposite of Project 3, but have it be like Project 5, Project 6, right?
Yeah.
And deck out, like work with all the runners at the back of the pack would be so cool. And I bet could have equally, if not more, of an outsized impact, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's just it was a reminder for me in watching it that like, yeah, we talk a lot about these experiential activations, but sometimes just like the nitty gritty of getting your product on people in the race can really make an impact.
It's almost like rethinking your activation. It's like our activation is actually on the course and it's the people that we're sponsoring. And I think that one really carries on. Like if you're thinking about the kind of that sub-elite, they're going to be running for years. They might even, eventually become elite. Who knows? And the training investment that the brand has made in them extends so far beyond just that one race. Like those are going to be your loyal athletes potentially for years to come.
Yeah. And you can't undercut the kit was sick.
Yeah.
And I love forcing men to wear pink and like something. That's going to appeal to me. I love that they didn't change. They're straight, like, this is your sherbet look. Like I think sometimes I don't want to undercut the value as a marketer sometimes of just like good products, right? Like we do a lot to say like, oh, the experience, the event, whatever. But sometimes like a really good, sick product on a lot of people is just the answer. Don't overcomplicate it.
Yeah. Yeah. Were there any other brands that really stood out to you as nailing it at either of those two events? I
mean, we have to give Adidas its flowers, at least in terms of like setting up their athletes for a great day in London, right? We can't talk about this without saying like they won,
Yeah. Through the shoe. Like that was the hero.
Well, they won through the athletes who were wearing their new shoe. It inevitably
their big win
helped
to me is like,
them.
This is the shoe that you're going to wear to hit that time. Yeah.
I mean, it's a crazy expensive shoe. I think it's the trickle down. I'm not sure it has the like cut through impact that the 4% did, just because the pricing is so insane at $500. Like I think it will impact the lower tiers of that. Cause the reality is like, how many of us need a $500 shoe? You don't. I'm telling you, everyone listening, you don't need it. Buy it. You can get the $250 one and you'll be fine. Right. Yeah. Even that is insane. But to have that moment, especially when Nike was struggling coming out of Boston, I wrote in my newsletter, like effectively kicking them when they're down, down on many levels. Like it's the kind of stuff that you can't script that as a brand. You can just hope that you're setting yourself up for success. And so when that happens, it's quite impressive. I will say Adidas otherwise, I thought in Boston, their impact is quite limited, even given that they're the brand title sponsor. They don't really, I think they had a lot of influencers in town. That was the most I could tell from what they were up to, other than the fact that they have, the apparel and the products for the race. But again, doesn't matter. Cut through, win when the time comes. And then I'll give Bandit credit. I think Boston, like I said, is tricky. It's especially tricky when I'm being the critic because I'm a lifelong Bostonian. So I'm very particular about how people choose to represent my city. I thought Bandit continued to show like their wit and clever approach to how they do these things, in that they really closely tied their product drop to the campaign itself. So Make Your Own Luck, that very vibey video where she's growing and it makes you think and try to understand it. And then product that's connected to the other garden. And so pulling on threads of Boston-ness that are like Irish, the Celtics. I thought it was fascinating that both in London and in Boston, they zigged where others zagged. In most people in the merch case, they just write London or Boston on the product. I'm pretty sure Bandit did not write. I think they wrote Marathon. Everything was in kind of London colors. I know they used a Union Jack, but they wrote Bandit instead of London. And in Boston, everything was in blue and green, and it said Bandit, and then had kind of like a NBA inspired runner symbol. So it was a bold move to not have anything Boston, because I will tell you, as someone who sold stuff at the marathon, if you put Boston on it, people will buy it. Yeah. What they wisely did was tie that product so specifically to this campaign and then to the experience that they did their pop-up, which was building on that like four-leaf clover, green, kind of verdant execution that was really well done. Allowed it all to sing together, right? Where I would maybe argue that, like, for me, the product wasn't that exciting, but when it was wrapped together in this smart, clever narrative that, you know, Banded, it's great at harnessing the power of like drop culture where it's like, it's there and then it's not. And so if you were excited about being part of this moment that Banded created for the marathon, like you had to get that gear, you know? So that power of scarcity, they've always been really good at harnessing, and they've become they've become really strong at their storytelling in addition to that.
Yeah, no, they've done a good job throughout marathon season, from what I can tell from the marketing perspective. Like the ads they've done at every step, I think have been really strong. Is there anything that you wish you'd seen that didn't show up in Boston or London?
Brands, I mean, we talked about it up top. I'd love to see like a girlier brand show up in a big way. I think Free People like does marathon etching, but that's about it.
Yeah.
Mile Off is one of my favorite little new women-led brands that's popping up. They did a small like group run, and they partner with Bioma, I think is how you pronounce it, beauty brand in London for their run, which is very small, very like, she's a one-woman show effectively. So it makes sense that she's not, you know, showing up in a big way yet.
Yeah, I don't know Mile Off. What's their kind of shtick?
So it was founded about a year ago by a woman named Alice Bugeha. She's from the UK, but based in Dubai because she was brought there by Dyson for a job. And she's just really, she's young. She's in her 20s, and she's built this brand for effectively the run girlies. Like, you know, no shying away from that. And her vision is to make great technical products. They've created like a running vest that's built very specifically for women's boobs and has plenty of pockets for all the different things women might want to carry. And also been very pointy about saying like, hey, it's not shameful to wear a run vest for a 5K. Whereas I think like there's been a lot of debate about whether you can wear a run vest outside of an ultra or a marathon, and lots of women do. And so they're just owning it and saying like, hey, we're here for you, and we made a product that works. And then she's done a really, really good job on social of building in public. And she uses her story of building the brand to just, the brand's kind of mission is this idea to inspire women to like, you know, do what they didn't think they can do. So by showing like the ins and outs of like what happens when your samples get lost in China, you know, she's helping women say like, oh, I think I could maybe not launch a brand, but like, oh yeah, maybe I could try a marathon because I'm seeing this woman, you know, do hard things, and she's welcomed me in on that journey. So I think she's been really smart about that.
Yeah.
Again, super small, but I think I'd love to see a brand like that showing up at some of these races in a big way to make space for women, like I said, and you know, kind of execute in different ways, because I think she's got a different point of view. And then I was also thinking that when you asked this question, Diodora is on the up in running. Yeah. They have a fun opportunity, since they're so Italian, to like create an execution that I think people would really love. I know they don't like cringy Italian. I'm sure they could do it really well in a chic way.
They would.
But like, they have a strong point of view rooted in that Italian craft, Italian design. Like there's just so many opportunities for a brand like that to show up at a marathon in an interesting way. That could be like New Balance Run House, but like Italian and better. I don't know. So I think they have a cool opportunity.
And they've leaned so heavily into like collegiate sports and college athletes, like elite college athletes. It'd be interesting to pull in that as well, like bring on, I don't know, a university partner or whatever, like have a team that they sponsor. I don't know what they're doing in that space, but there could be some opportunities.
Yeah. No, it makes sense that they're not. They've definitely carved out, they're going after that high school and college youth runner and saying like, that's where we're going to make inroads with our high performance shoe, and kind of leaving everyone else to fight over this like 25 to 40-year-old runner. And hoping that like performance trickles up. So, you know, I think it's always smart to zig where others are zagging, especially as the market gets busier.
Yeah. Any other brands you wish you'd seen?
I mean, I was just working on a newsletter for next week that's about what Salomon was up to in Paris. And they did a really cool collaboration with L'Art d'Automobile in Paris, where they did like a racing themed execution of their Phantasm shoe. And they just really leaned into the opportunity to kind of own the Paris Marathon, which, you know, so many of these non-major races are starting to take up, almost as much energy as the majors themselves, especially when they're aligned with cities that have a real like sensibility. And Paris has an incredible running culture of its own. So again, I think it was smart that they focused their energy on a race that other people weren't making big noise at, because you get to own the opportunity. And they did it, Paris was a week before Boston. So they had the chance to kind of like take up noise, make space before the conversation kind of moved to these other two activations. But, when you see something cool in a city like Paris, you're like, okay, come compete among the rest of us in this space and let's see what you can do and see how you show up. So I think, again, maybe in the future it'd be interesting to see how they would execute.
Yeah. Cool. So thinking about all those brands that you just mentioned, if we were to kind of pull it together and synthesize it, do you see any common threads between what is really working or what's not working for that matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think that being really clear, I don't think that these races are the place to show up to launch a product and to make it about yourself. I think that runners come to these events to connect and be in community with other runners, and also to celebrate the achievement that has been training for these races. And so the brands that win are the ones that recognize that effectively it's not about them and figure out ways to like empower and enable those connections. Because I really think like it's tricky to have a product really stand out in that noise.
Yeah.
And to cut through in a way where people are like really excited about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that energy on the brand's part is better off saying like, this is a moment for us to meet the runners where they're at and, celebrate the work that they've done and create, meaningful connections that hopefully like ladder out. When I was at Tracksmith, we started stamping posters in 2017, and it was the best part of those pop-ups were insanely difficult. Stamping posters were the best part because you had this opportunity to take a minute and connect with a runner and hear their story and stamp a poster that was going to go on their wall. And, it's always so cool. Sometimes I'll hop on Zoom calls with someone and I'll see like a marathon poster behind them from like a year that maybe I was stamping. And again, it doesn't scale, but it really is like in service to the runner. And I think, in a city like Boston in particular, Tracksmith, I didn't talk about them too much, but they had a line out their door every single day. They really nailed some of that service to runners in that moment at that race. And they become synonymous with Boston in particular.
Yeah.
But it is really guided from that point of view of like creating an interesting experience for the runner. And so I think that's always what I'm looking for. And I think what the brands that are succeeding the most are thinking about that need and those wants really hard.
I love that advice because often when I have guests on here, maybe they've worked at really big brands. And so a lot of the advice that they give is very specific to having a certain budget. But I think that advice that you're giving applies whether you're a massive brand or a tiny little brand, and probably exactly what you all were trying to do with the Rec Room. If you were advising a small brand who wanted to stand out in a busy, like Marathon Village or a Fashion Week Village or any of those big events, what would be your advice for what they should consider to stand out?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to give it on the macro level, but, I think number one is like, what is the most true thing to your brand, right? If people are going to interact with your brand, they have to take something away from your brand. And so whatever you're doing needs to really be the sharp, pointy edge of like what you stand for as a brand. So I think that any activation, any way you show up needs to be like really closely tied to your unique selling point in the market, right? And so you have to start with that. Like, why do you exist? Who do you serve? What makes you different? And then how can you create an activation or experience that amplifies that seed of a message, right? Race Face with Bonzer, it's a product for women that makes them feel cool and good on race day and outside of race day. And so how do we amplify that by creating an experience that's about, celebrating women on race day and making them feel beautiful and like themselves and celebrating that, right? And so when you're dialed in on the who you are and the why, figuring out an activation that makes sense, and ideally is an activation that feels different, right? Is not just another run house where you can engrave your medal and go for a shakeout, right? I would say do not show up like that. Like figure out what's the unique way that truly represents your brand that you can, come out. And I think, we didn't talk about pioneers. I know you had Sid on before.
Yeah.
He's done an incredible job of doing that, right?
Totally.
They show up in service of their community, show up in ways that feel purposely built for people of color and what they want to experience at a race that is truly welcoming to every runner. The interlude I thought was really cool that they created. Again, seeing a white space in the activation that is fun and then elevates creativity and music and cultural opportunities that other brands can't do. What are the things another brand cannot do? Do that, right?
Yeah. That's the advice right there. Like figure out what you can only do uniquely and do that, which actually, coming back to the Rec Room, is a thing. I mean, you're not a brand, but collectively you, Cole and Katie, bring something really special. And probably the Rec Room is something that not many other teams could have executed. Do you?
Not on a text message and a notes app.
And a shoestring budget. Yeah. Do you think you're going to bring the Rec Room back?
Yeah, I think we'd love to bring it back. There's so many moving parts and our collective real jobs to manage. But yeah, I think we'd love to continue to build on it and to figure a way to hit another major.
Any brands or opportunities you see that you'd want to bring in next time?
I think there's cool to me, Rec Room is kind of like a magazine. Right? It's a living magazine and me, Katie and Cole are the editors. So I think looking at it that way, thinking about who are partners that are complementary to the brands that we already kind of have. I think what was really cool about Rec Room, for example, was we only had one fueling partner. We had POW Labs. And I think being pointed about that is really nice because it's one, this is the curation is such an overused word, but we're not overwhelming you with saying like, here are your choices. We're saying like, the fueling brand we're celebrating here is POW, and this is what we love about them. So I think what I'd be excited about doing is bringing in non-endemic partners that maybe could speak to it. I think, I've been writing about it a lot. There's a huge opportunity for beauty in the space. And so I'd love to partner with, a smart beauty brand that felt wise, or maybe it's just sunscreen, right? So it's a little bit more accessible to something like that. But they also have big, deep pockets, so I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind a beauty check to support the Rec Room. But that's hard, right? You got to find the right partner who's not going to then make a slab like Maybelline all over it. Yeah. But yeah, there's room. There's room from like a wearable point of view. There's a lot of opportunities for brands. Again, it just has to be the right folks who get the vision of the Rec Room and want to support it and build on it rather than kind of like come in and take ownership. So that's the tricky part.
Cool. Okay, I've got two more questions for you. They're the two I always wrap up with. So the first one is, what brands are you keeping an eye on right now? Maybe even outside of the run space. Who's inspiring you, kind of popping up on your radar regularly?
I always talk about Bobby. I think that they do such an incredible job at marketing an unsexy product in a way that feels fun and clever. And they take really big swings. They make baby formula for folks who are not deep in toddler life. Yeah. But I knew about them before I was a mom because of my sister. She used the formula and I liked them before I even, had the opportunity to use the product. I always recommend whenever people are trying to figure out their social strategy, I say, go take a look at how Bobby does it because I think they're worth taking notes on. Yeah. And then I really love Spence, which is an up and coming tennis brand. I think they just have a really unique point of view on the sport and always present things in a really beautiful way. Yeah. All the women-led sport brands are the ones that I'm always watching really closely. So Half Day, Scenic, Hiker Kind, nice. All of them.
Some of my faves in there. We're actually going to have the last CMO of Half Days on the podcast in a couple of weeks. Cool. And we should probably tap the girls at Hiker Kind soon too. I've been following their journey since day one. I visit them whenever I'm in New York. I think their product is chef's kiss. It's just so good.
Yeah, and I feel like it'd be interesting to talk to them because they've taken a step up in terms of like their marketing in the last like year, and it'd just be interesting to learn about like how do you gear shift as a brand? You're starting to like really find your momentum. I think is really interesting.
Going from kind of small brand to one that's more regularly on the radar would be really interesting. I agree. Okay, Lee, what is the best piece of brand or marketing advice you've ever received?
I'm not sure I can distill distill it into something that someone has told me. But I think if I were to take my core kind of guiding principle is that this idea that like emotion is a KPI, right? Mm-hmm. It's hard. It's easier than ever to track, right? Because it's that share button on an Instagram post, right? Yeah. If you see that one being up really high, you know you've nailed an emotion, or maybe you've nailed a bad emotion, vice versa. But it is hard to measure other than that. But if you are creating content or building a story or creating a campaign and you're centering the emotion and you're starting from an emotion, that's the strongest way to go to market. Yeah. And if you don't know what that emotion is that you want people to feel at the end of the day when they engage with a piece of content or with a story, like your brief is messed up, right? Yeah. You need to like, you should leave your brief knowing really clearly, like, here's the emotion we want someone to feel when they engage with this piece of content. And you should start, actually I was working on a campaign with a brand around Mother's Day stuff. And we've been talking about the idea of saying the quiet part out loud. And so that was the brief to creating this social content that was very much around sharing kind of thoughts that a mother might feel on the run. And we put it up, and in the comments, literally someone wrote, "Thank you for saying this out loud," right? And so then I screenshotted that and I was like, okay, that's when you know you nailed it, where they basically take your internal language and they say it back to you. But that's emotion as a KPI, right? Like we wanted people to understand that that's what we were doing. And so I think when you can get clear on that, it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. And that's a strong brief right there. And I think so many brands might think they're starting with a feeling, but unless you articulate it in such clear language, it's really hard to say, did we achieve it? But you all capture that from the outset, from the sounds like. A friend of mine here in Vancouver, an ex-Lululemon leader, she runs a program called Community Academy, which trains people to do IRL activations and community building in brand. Krista Hull, she always says that her top KPI is just goosebumps. Like, did it give goosebumps? And I love that. Okay, Lee, where should people find you online? What's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah, so I'm one of one. I'm pretty sure I'm the only Lee Glandorf in the world. So you can find me at most places where that is the case. On Instagram, my website's leeglandorf.com. And then my newsletter, the Sweat Lookbook, is on Substack. You can find me there.
Which I highly recommend. Awesome. Thanks, Lee. This was fun.
Thank you so much.
That was Lee Glandorf. Find and subscribe to the Sweat Lookbook on Substack. And listen up, if you're a CMO, a CBO, a marketing director, or even a marketing manager, we're making this for you. I'd love to hear from you. Who do you want to hear from on the show? What are the questions you wish you could ask your peers? And what's the conversation you're not having that you really wish you could? Send me an email and let me know at amanda@mondaycreative.co. And while you're at it, like and subscribe to my best campaign on whatever platform you're on, and leave us a review to help this thing grow. My Best Campaign is brought to you by Monday Creative. The episode was produced by Emily Heibeck and hosted by me, Amanda Lee Smith. Our sound engineer is Andrew Bagaspas, and our theme music is by Shimon Machida.